The morning it started, the lake was so still it looked like a sheet of polished glass. I'd lived on that shoreline for over 30 years, long enough to remember when the only sounds were loons calling and the soft slap of water against the dock. I was standing there with my coffee, watching the sun crawl over the trees, when I noticed a bright red stake driven into the sand near the waterline. A thin rope ran from it to another stake farther down, cutting off a stretch of shoreline I'd walked, fished, and maintained for decades. At first, I thought maybe someone's kid had been playing a prank. Then I saw the laminated sign hanging from the rope, and my stomach tightened. Private HOA shoreline. No trespassing. I stood there longer than I cared to admit, reading it over and over, waiting for it to make sense. This wasn't a private beach. This was my shoreline, attached to my deed, governed by the same lake regulations it always had been. The subdivision uphill had an HOA, sure, but they were newer, built years after I'd already retired here. I had heard complaints before about my old wooden dock, about my fishing lights at night, but this was different. This felt like someone had finally decided to test how far they could push. Later that morning, as I was pulling weeds near the water, a woman approached along the shore. She was dressed like she meant business, clipboard tucked under her arm, sunglasses perched just right. Without introducing herself, she told me the HOA had determined the shoreline was community access and that I was no longer allowed to use it for personal purposes. She spoke with confidence, the kind that assumes compliance before the conversation even starts. I told her calmly that she was mistaken and that my property line extended into the water as defined by state law. She smiled thinly and said the HOA's attorney disagreed. Over the next week, the conflict grew. More stakes appeared. Ropes tightened. I found a notice taped to my mailbox, warning me about unauthorized shoreline use. Neighbors I'd known for years started asking questions, worried they'd lose access. Next, the HOA president, because that's who she turned out to be, seemed emboldened. Showing up with others from the board, pointing, taking photos, acting as if the lake had suddenly become theirs by declaration alone. I pulled out my old documents, just like I had when I first bought the place. Deed, survey, lake association rules, and correspondence from the water board going back decades. Everything was clear. Shoreline rights were determined by property ownership, not HOA votes. Still, the stress weighed on me. At my age, I wasn't looking for a legal battle. I just wanted to sit by the water and enjoy the years I'd earned. Things came to a head when I found a temporary fence panel placed right across the path to my dock. That was the moment frustration turned into resolve. I called the regional water board directly and requested an on-site review. To my surprise, they responded quickly. Maybe they'd seen this sort of thing before. The day the water board representative arrived, the lake wasn't calm anymore. Wind rippled the surface and gray clouds rolled in, matching the mood. The HOA president was already there when I walked down, standing stiffly with two board members beside her. The representative listened quietly as she explained how the HOA believed the shoreline should belong to the community for safety and fairness. Then it was my turn. I handed over the documents, explained the history, and pointed out the markers that had existed long before the subdivision was built. The representative walked the shoreline slowly, measuring, checking maps, asking questions. No one spoke while he worked. Finally, he stopped near the original red stake, pulled it out of the sand, and handed it back to the HOA president. He said, plainly and without drama, that the shoreline belonged to me, as defined by law, and that the HOA had no authority to claim or restrict it. He added that placing barriers violated state water access regulations and would need to be removed immediately. The silence that followed was thick. The HOA president's face flushed, and she tried to argue, but the representative cut her off. He told her that if the obstructions weren't removed by the end of the day, the water board would step in and issue penalties. There was no anger in his voice, just finality. By evening, the ropes were gone. The stakes were pulled. The fence panel disappeared as quietly as it had arrived. The shoreline looked like it always had, open and peaceful. The next week, a formal letter arrived, stating the water board's findings and warning the HOA against future interference. Word spread fast. I noticed fewer stares from uphill and more friendly waves. Life returned to its slower pace. I went back to fishing in the early mornings, watching the seasons change across the water. But I didn't forget the lesson. Even after a lifetime of ownership, you sometimes have to stand up and remind people that rights aren't granted by confidence or clipboards. They're written, recorded, and protected for a reason. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps keep these real-life stories coming. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments and say hello.